Hi, as I had promised earlier, I will be making lecture series or rather mini lectures or essence of chapters for Intermediate Microeconomics of Varian. So let's start the first chapter, which is the market. So the first chapter, the market, we will first start talking about model optimization and equilibrium. So what is a model? Model is a simplified version of reality. Now we can complicate the model dependent upon the situation we want. So in economics, what we do is we take reality, and when we have to analyze something, we remove out the unnecessary parts and we just have an abstract version of reality, which is a simple version of reality. So that's the idea. You will understand more about what we mean by model as we proceed ahead in the chapters. So let's just take this with a grain of salt that model is an abstract form of reality which is a simple version of reality. So let's take an example, and let's take the example of this chapter only. So I will just point you towards the chapter, and in the chapter the model is of market for apartments in a medium sized midwestern college town. So in this model, it's about getting access to apartments which are going to be on rent. So you will have to pay a price for the rent, and who will get those apartments? So over here there are two kinds of apartments: the adjacent apartments adjacent to the campus, or rather I should say adjacent to the university, and the outer ring apartments which are away from the university. Definitely the closer the inner ring apartments will be in higher demand. So for our purpose, what we will be doing is we will be supposing that there are many apartments available in the outer ring. So anybody can have those apartments with certain known level of price, and only will be modeling the inner ring apartments. So when we are talking about inner ring apartments, the price of the inner ring apartments will be endogenous to the model, determined by the model, and the price of the outer ring apartments will be exogenous to the model, not determined by the model. So to sum it up, we are considering market for apartments which are going to be on rent, and you have two kinds of apartments: inner, outer. Inner is more desirable and outer is of sufficient number of quantity. So outer apartments really do not have any kind of economic interest to us, because the price level is certain known value and it is outside the purview of our model, and we call such things or such variables as exogenous, and the price of the inner ring as endogenous, determined by the forces inside the model or the parameters or the interactions inside the model. Now how about how do we solve these things? How do we solve for the price of inner ring apartments? So there comes optimization and equilibrium. Now what is optimization? Optimization essentially means that people generally maximize their well-being, maximize their happiness, basically maximize any kind of good outcome for themselves. If we just read the book's definition of Varian, it says that people try to choose the best patterns of consumptions that they can afford. As I just said, if you have a certain amount of money, you want the best thing for yourself. That is optimization. What is equilibrium? Equilibrium essentially is something like you have two forces and you have to balance them out. For our case, let's say supply of inner ring apartments and demand of inner ring apartments. You have to balance them out. That is the equilibrium. If we proceed ahead, once we have started a discussion on supply of inner ring apartments and demand of inner ring apartments, we have to understand how do we construct a demand function or a demand curve. How do we do that? So to understand demand curve, we have to understand the concept of reservation price. Now what is reservation price? Now reservation price is something which is like the highest price which you are willing to pay for certain good. In other words, it is the price of a good at which you are indifferent between buying that good and not buying that good. So let us say if I ask you, will you buy this variant for 100 rupees? You might say yes. Will you buy this for 200 rupees? You might say again yes. Will you buy this for 300? Now you may start thinking, no, I will not. So probably your reservation price was somewhere between 200 to 300, right? I can further narrow it down. I can ask 250, 230, 270, and I can figure out what's the reservation price. So that's the idea of reservation price. Now let's understand what reservation price is by the bookish definition. Economists call a person's maximum willingness to pay for something that person's reservation price. Let's just think about reservation price on a chart. So let me just erase this part and let's draw the chart. Let us suppose, according to the chapter over here, 500 is the reservation price for the first customer, right? So I will say first unit of apartment will be sold in 500 and the next reservation price is 490. So from 500 till 490 nothing will be sold. So the demand will stick to 1. Now if the next reservation price was, let us suppose, 470. So let me just say 470. I am deviating a bit from the book, right? Just to give you a sense of what's happening over here. So my second unit will be sold at 490 because that's the reservation price, second unit. What about the third? So let me just write the second over here. So till 470 only 2 goods will be sold or 2 apartments will be rented. That's the idea over here, because from 500 to 491, from 490 to 471, and at 470 we will have one another sale. So we can say that this will keep on happening. Let's say the next thing over here is, let's suppose 100. So this will go on like this. This is your 3. Okay, so this is the idea. This is how you draw the reservation price, and this essentially also forms the demand curve because it is giving you the units in the x-axis and the price in the y-axis. Now if the reservation price was changing very smoothly, meaning from 500 to 499, from 499 to 498, then 497. Essentially what I'm trying to say is the difference between the two reservation prices starts becoming very narrow. Then these lines will become very small, even these gaps will become very small. So then you will have a smooth curve and you will have something like a downward sloping curve, and that will be your downward sloping demand curve. Now obviously you have a better diagram in the book, but I tried to give it intuition behind the downward sloping demand curve using reservation prices, and I hope this was clear to you. Now what about the supply curve? Now supply curve would look something like this. Now why so? Because for a short duration of time, rather in short run, the number of apartments will not change, which means no matter what the price is for the apartment for rent, the number of apartments available for renting purpose will not change. That is why a vertical supply curve. Now the thing over here is that we are considering a situation where all the landlords are behaving independently and everybody has full information. So in that kind of a structure you have a competitive market. Nobody can give you a different price. You have to stick to the same price, right? That's the framework of competitive market. Now we will talk more about competitive market in subsequent chapters, but for now let's just think about it in this way, that all the landlords are identical, they have complete information, and even the tenants are having complete information. So if this is my supply curve and we've already understood that we have a downward demand curve, then this is the point of your equilibrium. So you can say that this is your P star, equilibrium price, and this is your Q star, or the equilibrium quantity. So this is your equilibrium for demand and supply curve. When supply is constant, demand is downward sloping. Now what will happen if I do not have a price equal to P star? Let us suppose the price is greater than equilibrium price. In that scenario, let us take this example. You will have excess supply because only this number of people are demanding your apartment, but this much is in supply. So this is the excess supply. So when you have excess supply, what will happen? There will be few landlords who will not get tenants. So what will they do? They will lower their price. The moment they lower their price, as the information is spreading all throughout the market, people will start going to those landlords. This won't be sustainable and the prices will come down from here to P star. Now, what about a lower level? If you have a lower level, what will happen is you will have an excess demand, and the moment you have an excess demand, there will be tenants who will not get apartments. So what will they do? They will try to get those apartments, and the landlords will know that there are tenants who are willing to pay more, so they will increase the price. So even this price is not sustainable, it will increase till P star. So this is a simple demand and supply curve meeting point, which you already might be aware if you are interested in economics, but this was important to cover for the sake of completeness. That was the idea over here. And we also understood a very subtle aspect of competitive market, that we have a full information structure over here. Okay, let's try to move to the next part of it. And then what's the next part? The next part over here is what will happen if there is some kind of a shock. Now, what do I mean by shock? Let us suppose suddenly you have more number of apartments. So what will happen to the supply curve? It will change, and you have the same demand curve. So let us think of that scenario. You have this demand curve, this is your old supply, and now you have more supply of apartments. So this is your new supply, which means your equilibrium price will change from this to this, and even the equilibrium quantity will change. And the same will happen if you have lesser number of apartments, just in the other direction. If you have less apartments, you will have a greater price. Just think about in this way, you will have a greater price. So that is something which will happen if you have sudden shock in the system, sudden less or more number of apartments. Now when I say sudden, I do not mean instantly. So when I mean sudden, what I'm trying to hint towards is comparative statics. Now in comparative statics, what we do is we change some parameter of the model and then see what will happen to the equilibrium. We are not concerned how long it takes to get to the equilibrium or how we move to the equilibrium, but what will be the equilibrium, new equilibrium. So from old equilibrium to new equilibrium is known as comparative statics, and we are just interested in old and new, not the transition part. What if the landlords decide to convert two apartments to one? So in place of this old supply curve, they decrease it to half. What will happen? Obviously you will have an increased price, right? So that's the idea over here, that you can change the supply, or you can also change the demand curve. How you can change that? Let us suppose that you build new apartments, right? And if you are building new apartments, people who are in old apartments, they might want to move to the new apartments. So that might create a lesser demand for the old apartments, and we are only concerned about our kind of apartments which are already existing in the inner ring. So let us say in the inner ring we have different kinds of apartment, a bit expensive in nature, kind of a lavish apartment. So few people from our earlier set will choose those apartments. So our current market structure will change. So demand curve might shift down. So this is a basic idea on comparative statics. Now there is an example over here about incidence of tax. What happens if the government decides to impose a tax on the landlords? Think about it. There is a supply, this is a demand, we have a tax on landlords. What will happen to the supply? If you have a tax, will the supply change? In short run, the number of apartments for rent will remain the same, right? And will the demand change? Why should it change? Because the number of people who want your apartments remains the same. So neither supply nor demand curve changes. So your equilibrium price remains the same, which means the entire amount of tax will be borne by the landlords. It will be from the landlord's pockets. Now there's a concept of elasticity, and because the supply curve over here is not elastic, that is the reason your entire tax is on the supply side of the market. We will talk more about the incidence of tax and its relation to the elasticity in later chapters. Now this was the basic structure for competitive market. Now what other kinds of market structures we can have? A good segue would be towards discriminating monopolist. A discriminating monopolist identifies the person who is willing to pay the maximum first. So any person who is having the highest reservation price will be sold apartment the first time. Then he will identify the person who has second highest reservation price. Now yes, there's a small point over here which I missed out. What is a monopolist? Who is a monopolist? Now we will talk about monopoly in further chapters, but in simple terms, when you only have one supplier or one seller, that's a monopoly, right? Or rather, that person or organization is your monopolist. So this discriminating monopolist will identify the people based on the reservation prices, and he will sell his produce to the people with highest reservation price and then go on in decreasing order. So in this what will happen? So if we are considering our same inner ring apartment market, the same number of apartments are available, right? Because supply is fixed. So it will be given to the same number of people, and the same people also who were buying in the competitive market. But the price will change. We will charge different prices to different people. But in the competitive market, we just had one price, the intersection of demand and supply. But the discriminating monopolist has an advantage. He is knowing the reservation price for every person. So he is going to charge the reservation price of each one of you. So he will be selling the same number of apartments for rent, but he will be charging higher price. So you can say that the distribution of apartments remain the same, but the apartment seller, or rather I should say landlord, not seller, because apartments are not sold over here, it's been given on rent. So the landlord will get more money, and it will hurt your tenants. So the idea is that there's only small difference between a discriminating monopolist and a competitive market, that in competitive market we have one price. So few people from the demand side have that advantage, they pay lesser than their reservation price. But in discriminating monopolist, everybody pays their reservation price. So all the gains goes to the monopolist, discriminating monopolist. What about the ordinary monopolist? The ordinary monopolist does not know reservation prices. So he has a choice of only one price for all, but still he is a monopolist. So he commands the price setting side of the market. He will set the price. He will not let the market decide the price. Now, what is the difference over here? If you let the market decide the price, we already know what will happen. It will be the intersection of supply and demand, But what will happen in monopoly? So if this is my demand curve, now let us suppose my monopolist is charging me this price. Let's just think about it for a while. So this is height is my price, and this thing over here is my quantity or demand, I can say. So this guy over here is P into Q. Price times quantity is the revenue. So my monopolist would like to maximize this area, or rather P into Q, right? So how will it maximize? Obviously this P into Q will be greater at some value which is not exactly equal to P star. So generally speaking, a monopolist charges you more than the P star, and the amount, if it's more than P star, definitely you have lesser number of apartments getting on rent. So that's the idea over here, that the market is not getting entire apartments for rent, and the market is paying greater than the competitive market. So which goes on to say that ordinary monopolist, in the process of maximizing their revenue, brings in inefficiency inside the market. We will talk more about in future chapters. There could be also a control on the prices by the government or some kind of a public body, like rent control. Now let us say what will happen if we have a rent control on the market. So if we have a rent control, the government decides to have an upper cap on the rent. Now obviously upper cap which is greater than the equilibrium price makes no sense, because anyway P star or the equilibrium price is accepted by the market. So nobody is going above P star, they will be happy at P star. But let's say the rent is at lower than P star, the rent control is for less than P star, then what will happen? This is your P star, and I fix this as my rent control. So definitely you will have an excess demand in the market, and this is a kind of inefficiency. So whether you are in rent control regime or the ordinary monopoly regime, you have some kind of an inefficiency. We will talk more about this kind of inefficiencies in future chapters, but this was a basic idea on rent control. Now what about ranking these distributions? The competitive market, the discriminating monopolist, the ordinary monopolist, and rent control. So to rank this, we need to understand a concept called Pareto efficiency. Now, what exactly is Pareto efficiency? Pareto efficiency means that if we can make a group or a person better off without hurting some group or some person, then you are not Pareto efficient. You are in the state of world which is Pareto inefficient. So to have a Pareto efficient outcome, you must have no possibility of making anyone happy without hurting someone else. So that's the idea over here. So in the four markets over here, you can just say that the competitive market and the discriminating monopoly, you cannot benefit anyone, because in the competitive market, everybody who wants to pay more than the reservation price or equal to reservation price are getting their apartments, right, and at the price of your equilibrium price. And same goes for your discriminating monopolist. The only change is it is equal to their reservation price. So you cannot make anyone happier by not hurting someone else. But what about your ordinary monopolist? For the case of ordinary monopolist, what will happen is that we know that the ordinary monopolist is charging a higher price than the equilibrium price in the market, which means, let us say the ordinary monopolist decides that let me charge a very small price, right, to only one customer. So he can be made better off, even that customer would be made better off, and without hurting anyone else. I am not charging that price to anyone else. So definitely this is a room of improvement in Pareto, or rather I can say there's a room for Pareto improvement. So this is not Pareto efficient. But obviously, if you can charge a different price to someone, you are not an ordinary monopolist. So that's the idea over here. What about rent control? Even in rent control, as you have an excess amount of demand, you can say that, look, I know that the rent control is at T bar. Let me offer you an apartment at a greater rent, right? What will happen there? You suddenly make two people more happier. The person who is not getting the apartment and the landlord who is getting lesser than the equilibrium rent, which is again not Pareto optimal. So definitely your rent control in ordinary monopolist market is not Pareto optimal, and the earlier two were Pareto optimal. So this was the idea about Pareto efficiency and ranking these four kinds of market dynamics. Now, what about your supply in the long run? We have already talked that in the short run, supply will be vertical or rather inelastic. In the long run, supply might change based on various factors, and that will be the course of discussion for your future chapters. Now, let's solve the end of the chapter questions. So you can also have your own Varian book with you so that you don't miss out on the subtleties. Suppose that there were 25 people who had a reservation price of 500 and the 26th person had a reservation price of 200. What will be the demand? What would the demand curve look like? Let's draw it. So you have 25 people with 500 and then you have 200. This is your 25 and this is your 26. What this will be how the demand curve would look like. So you can say this. This is your demand curve. Now, in the above example, what would be the equilibrium price if there were 24 apartments to rent? So if I have 24 apartments to rent, which means this is my supply at 24. So I will be giving it to people who have a reservation price of 500. So equilibrium price will be 500. What if there were 26 apartments to rent? In that case, this will be your supply. So in that scenario, this is your intersection point. So 200 will be your equilibrium price. And what will happen if there were 25 apartments to rent? So if my supply becomes this, it will be anything between 200 to 500 because it is overlapping the demand curve. So supply demand on the same line between 200 to 500. So I'll have any solution which is between 200 to 500. Now, if people have different reservation prices, why does the market demand curve slope down? Because that's the idea over here. Because if my reservation prices is decreasing, so what if you decrease the reservation price, your quantity will increase. So it's like this, you go down and then right. So that's why downward curve. In the text, we assumed that the condominium purchaser came from the inner ring people. So I will leave 4 and 5 as an exercise because I have not discussed this point. This point is inside the chapter which says that let us suppose the condominium purchasers came from the inner ring or the outer ring. What will happen? So what happens is the supply curve shifts. So I don't want to give the solution to this because or else it will be spoon feeding. But it is not that a difficult question. It's just a matter of what will happen to your supply curve, because the demand curve will only change if the question is specifically mentioning that. Let's say outer ring people come, so demand curve will not change because we have outside market forces coming in. But what if inner ring people have different taste? Then your demand curve will change. So you have to figure this out. I'm not giving you spoon feeding on these answers. This is some, because or else you will have nothing to practice. Now, what do you suppose the effect of tax would be on the number of apartments that would be built in the long run? Then obviously, if you're imposing tax, people will build lesser amount of apartments. So 7 is based on ordinary monopolist, and yes, you solve this question very easily. You have to maximize the revenue for the monopolist. So P into Q. Q over here is your D, which is 100 minus 2P, right? And 100 minus 2P multiplied by P is your revenue. Maximize the revenue. That's a simple question. If our model of rent control allowed for unrestricted subletting, who would end up getting apartments in the inner circle? Obviously the people who have highest reservation prices, because ultimately if you have subletting, you are giving an opportunity to the market to find the people who value the apartments the most. So that is the idea, and obviously the outcome should be Pareto efficient, because there will be all gains of trade getting exhausted. Now I have tried to cover the essence of this chapter in this short video, not short in the sense of duration, but rather short in respect to the chapter's length and the scope of the chapter. So my idea was to give you a push, and this push should be for you to start reading the book. It is not a substitute for your personal reading. It is like a helping hand. So do not think of this session as a spoon feeding session where you come in, you watch the entire video and work gets over. No, this is just an aid to your reading, just a way to motivate you to read, because even I have read this chapter for you and made this video, because obviously I will not remember everything which I have read in the last 2-3 years, because my work has changed a lot. I do not work on economics on a daily basis. So pick up your Varian textbook and read it, and this video will definitely help you in that. So solve the end of the chapter questions, solve the workbook of Varian, and then let's see where you stand. We will add more such videos for future chapters. We have a lot of chapters to cover. So hope to meet you soon again, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done already.